Welcome to Life on Mars, the podcast of MarsBased, where we talk entrepreneurship, technology, and innovation. And today we've got our very own first guest for 2021, Pau Ramon, CTO at Factorial. Welcome to the show, Pau. How are you doing?
Thanks for having me. Yeah, I'm doing fine.
It's great because this is the first podcast we record in 2021 with a guest. I recorded one talking about our 2020 recap last week, and we're back to interviews. And this one's very special because we're going back to Rails. We haven't talked about Rails. We haven't talked with the CTO for like 6 or 7 shows. So I think it's great to go back to nerding out a little bit in this episode. How often do you talk in podcasts or interviews or events about technology, Pau? Because CTOs, technically, they don't get out of the cave that much, do they?
Yeah, I used to do that more often, and I was pretty involved in several development communities and so on. But then I became a parent, and everything that was off hours was a bit of a stretch for me. So on the last 3 years, I haven't been that involved. Although now of course, if it happens like now during working hours, it's perfectly fine. But I miss it a lot, especially development communities. That's where you meet the interesting people, and that's where most of the interesting hiring happens. So yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about you to give context to our audience. And you started developing more than 10 years ago. I mean, you've been also a founder of a company in San Francisco. It's called Speaker. I wanted to focus on the last 2 companies you've been working on because we know them more, just because we can relate to them. You were the CTO at Redbooth, that formerly was called TeamBox. That's something that we had used at the very beginning of MarsBased. We were organizing our projects with TeamBox at the very beginning. Then you rebranded. That was a really fun story that Pablo Villalba told us. And you became the CTO of Redbooth just because you had met Jordi, the former CTO back then, who is now the CEO of Factorial, right? So you kind of like took over his duties twice. Can you tell a little bit the story, how you met him and how did you get into Redbooth?
Yeah, so basically I was, as you mentioned, I was in San Francisco for 3 months. I mostly went there for a conference and stayed because, in the States, everybody tells you, no, stay here, it's the land of opportunities. And I kind of got into it, and I was trying to find a job. And at that time, I was basically coding for TeamBox. So I was living with Pablo Villalba in San Francisco, and he was offering me a couch, and I was basically doing...
That's very Pablo.
Yeah. I was the cheapest developer in the world, although, a couch in San Francisco is expensive. But yeah.
You're
so
right.
I was doing that while I was looking for a job there. But short story is that I had to come back. I didn't have a visa. No one sponsored me a visa. So I came back to Barcelona. And the most obvious option for me was to keep coding, but that's time for money. So I had a house here, so I didn't need a coach from Pablo anymore. And then at that time, Jordi was the CTO, but he left to become a CEO at ITNIC. And then I basically was... the chosen one to take on his role. Then he came back, and then we eventually both left and founded Redbooth, and I stayed with that role because I think it's the one that suits me better.
So you've kind of like taken over from him a couple of times, right? Because at Redbooth first, Factorial, then when he created Factorial, I think it was in 2016, if I remember correctly. Did you join from the very beginning? Did you join a little bit later? How was it? Are you part of the founding team?
I'm actually a founder. So yeah,
great.
So it was very clear initially when we started the roles of Bernat, Jordi, and me. So that was written on paper even before we had the name. So that was very clear from the beginning. And again, like I know very well my characteristics are more aligned with being a CTO than not other aspects of the business. Yeah.
Because let's talk about that, because a lot of people, I get like 10 to 12 people per week asking me for a CTO, right? There are a lot of entrepreneurs out there. We're involved with Startup Grind. We're involved with a lot of startup communities in Barcelona. And because we're sort of one of the companies in technical reference in Barcelona, at least for Rails or for JavaScript, a lot of people come to us like, hey, can you find me a CTO? It's like, well, we don't do that. But you being a CTO, so what would be your motivations to join a company? Like, has it have to be a technical founder, somebody you admire? Is it money? Is it fame? Is it what?
Of course, it depends a lot. It does help if the founder is technical, because then you can have a more honest conversation about what's expectation. In my personal case, both Bernat and Jordi, they are engineers.
They are developers.
So that really helps a lot. But that also makes the job easier for them because they can evaluate the candidate. So they can choose a CTO over another one because they are technical themselves. A lot of business owners struggle because they are not technical themselves, and you don't know what you don't know. So it's very hard for them to really connect with the CTO and understand whether it's a lemon or an apple. In terms of, as a CTO, what you look for, there's different things that come to mind. One of them is the stage of the company. So it's extremely different, the CTO role on early stage than the CTO role on late stage. So your functions are completely different. One of them is you have to be scrappy. You're probably paying below market rate. You have to pitch to investors. You have to do a lot of things that are interesting, but it's not for everybody. And on a late stage, you are more of a systematic, process-driven kind of. You have to do things. You're not gathering, you're farming. So that's very different approach. So stage for me, it's important. I'm more of a starter than a finisher. So I prefer to be on the initial stage of companies. Then in terms of salary, it depends. Because if you're joining the founding team, you're mostly going to negotiate for equity. So that's not that important unless you do a CTO role as a mercenary or like just as a professional and you just want the salary. But most of the times when you're a CTO, you're gonna basically bet your next 10 years of your life. Depends if everything goes well, you're betting your whatever amount of years of your life on a project. So the most important is the potential that you see on that project, because you're not gonna get rich with the salary. I actually lost money on the first 2 years in Factorial, so I had to.
You invested.
Yeah, I know. But in terms of salary, it wasn't my best thing. But of course, it's a bet that you're doing on the long term. Yeah. I don't know if that answers.
And how about the technical challenge? Totally answers the question, but I got a couple more things to add up to that, which is one of them is a technical challenge, right? Because sometimes people are looking for CTO co-founders and their project, to be honest, is very easy. It could be like done with a Typeform and Zapier and something else. You don't really need a CTO for that. And if you're hiring a CTO too early in the company, maybe that person is not the right person later on, and you have jeopardized the CTO role and position. Yeah. And even shares in the company with somebody who probably was not the right CTO all along, right? So can you tell us about the what kind of challenge would you be looking for in a new company, right? How do you evaluate that?
Yeah, so I mean, that's hard to measure because sometimes when you join the boat, you don't really know exactly what you're building. Like it took us 3 years to find product market fit, and we tried a lot of things. So it was not very clear. Yeah, at Factorial. So it was not very clear to me exactly which kind of technological challenge I would find on the way. That being said, I think there are CTOs that maybe are more techy and they are looking for more edge technologies or problems like machine learning and things like that. I'm not that sort of CTO. I do believe the biggest challenge usually is to survive, and that means being able to hire a good team to basically pitch to investors when you need money. It's like for me, it's more the survival of the first year was the biggest challenge, not that much the technical one. So I'm not that attracted on those big gigantic technical projects. I'm more attracted on building a business and building a great team.
Yeah, because there are several kinds of CTOs, right? There's a scrappy CTO, there's a hacker CTO, there's a political CTO, there's a fundraising CTO, right? Yeah. There's more like a people-oriented CTO. There's a lot of them, and people tend to think all CTOs are equal, but truth is they're not. How about, when you join a company, when you join Redbooth, I want to circle back to that a little bit before we delve farther into Factorial. You join a team that was already existing, you had already a technology, but you join as a CTO, right? If I remember correctly. So how do you take the decision of keeping what works? How do you inspect it? Because normally a CTO goes into a company like, what the fuck is this shit, right? And just takes a look at everything, analyzes, audits, is like, oh, wow, why are we doing these processes? And the temptation is to change everything, processes, team organization, tech stack. How did you face this situation?
Yeah, it was a difficult situation for me because, usually people have a lot of loyalty to whoever hired them. So there's kind of a link between the employer and the employee. And in that case, a lot of the team had to transition from reporting to Jordi to reporting to me, and I was quite new at the company. So there was a lot of trust that I had to gain from the current team. So of course, what no one wants to do is to arrive to a project and say everything is crap and let's start from scratch. I've seen CTOs doing it, and that definitely does not help gaining the trust from the people who actually wrote that code. So on that case, there was quite a lot of legacy on Redbooth, to be honest. Like there was a lot of transitions going on. Pablo was a guy with a lot of ideas, which meant there was a lot of MVPs and a lot of branches and things and so on.
And chaos. Chaos everywhere.
But I took the same approach as in Factorial, actually. It's to start from starting point and changing one thing at a time and trying, like, having very clear where I want to be, but doing it incrementally and doing one change at a time, and always involving the team by communicating the vision. And then if the whole team agrees of the direction that you want to be, then everybody contributes on that path, on that journey towards like less technical debt or different infrastructure or whatever, like whatever journey or vision you have for the future.
Did you find any sort of resistance from the team just because you joined as as an external person as opposed to promoting somebody internally? Have you ever faced a situation?
Of course I did. Like it was tough in the beginning. Like that's and Jordi is a very well respected person. Like everybody on the team loved him. So of course the transition was not easy. If Jordi had been evil or anything like that, then the transition would have been much better. But Jordi was a very beloved CTO at Redbooth, so I had to step up my game. That's for sure.
Yeah, how do you keep the expectations of the team, both in Redbooth and Factorial, in terms of, because you mentioned communication, right? Communication is very important, but we also know that communication is not the best skill of technical people, that including CTOs as well, right? Yeah. How do you manage this? How communicative are you? What are the best practices? What tools do you use? Like, what's your organization like in this regard?
Yeah, so I try to communicate a lot, especially around the technical vision. So I try to always document what I think technically we should go, and I communicate it in a way that I involve the people. So I want to hear their point of view. I want them to also write with me that vision. And then we have several rituals that help us have these kind of conversations more often. So it's super important to make the space for these conversations to happen. If you don't make the space, they don't happen. So one of them is obvious, is the one-on-ones. And on the one-on-ones, you need to have a very structured way to have these conversations going. Like, what do you feel could improve? What do you think we're doing wrong? That you want to ask these questions, trying to get this information from people, but also in a way for you to be able to reiterate over and over that product or technological vision. And then, of course, we have different meetings that allow people from the tech team to gather together, because they usually are on different teams and they are taking decisions and so on. But once in a while, we want to put them all together and discuss certain things that people have discovered on their individual teams.
And how about, let's talk about the technology, right? Because Redbooth, I don't know in your former companies, but Redbooth was well known for using Rails, right? And as you know, in MarsBased, we're a Rails specialized consultancy and JavaScript, of course. But we're very keen on using Rails. And the reality is, it's a big contrast with the opinion out there. I mean, if you read Twitter, Rails has been dead for 10 years, right? Whereas what we see from projects coming in, like literally in 2020, 2021, we had been getting more and more requests for Rails projects just because probably the companies created 6-7 years ago. Now they're big enough to start outsourcing, and the big tech giants like, Microsoft bought GitHub and Dropbox also, like, it's very big right now, and they also got Rails, and then Spotify's got Rails, and like lots of companies have been acquiring other smaller companies that they use Rails, right? So the reality is like the corporations now use Rails. So what would be your advice? How do you see this as, like, does this conflict with the vision from your team as well? Do you have Rails haters in Factorial and Redbooth?
We have a little bit of everything. But funny thing is, actually, a lot of people see myself as a Rails developer in JavaScript, But actually, on my previous jobs, I did PHP, I did Node.js, then at Redbooth, I did Rails. And funny enough, in Factorial, the initial idea was not to use Rails. It was actually the MVP. I built it on Elixir. And for one reason, like when you choose the technological stack, a lot of engineers will tell you the right tool for the right job, but that's often very difficult to measure. In my case, I wanted to do a little bit what Redbooth did at the time. So Redbooth was very novel in adopting Rails, and that allowed us to get a lot of talent in Barcelona that wanted to work with the stack when everybody was doing PHP and Java. So I thought probably Elixir would be that new kind of stack, Elixir or Go. On Insight, probably Go would have been more successful. But that was my initial idea, and that was my bet. Like, by betting on Elixir, I probably can get some developers that may want to work with this stack, and maybe they don't have so many offers in the table, so I may be able to recruit this initial team and get going. That being said, the MVP was done between Jordi and me, and Jordi very clearly told me, I have no time to learn Elixir, Phoenix, and all these new things.
Yeah,
we need an MVP done in 1 month, and we need to get the angel investment with an MVP and show it to some customers. So in the end, the only thing that we both knew enough to do that MVP in 1 month was Rails. So by the end, the most efficient tool for us to get started was Rails, and that's the stack that we ended up settling with, but was not the initial idea.
Yeah, because I mean, one of the strong points of Rails is precisely that. Like, you don't have to learn much stuff. Like, it works, it's magic, and if you know it, it's very easy, and people love it, right? But it's very interesting. I didn't know the story about Elixir, and in hindsight, it looks like a bad decision. But at the time, Elixir was like all the rage. Everybody, quote, was doing Elixir. Was passionate about Elixir, but I think, like, from my humble opinion, right, it hasn't really taken off as a technology for building the entire tech stack of companies. It's just like, it's meant to be for something and still doesn't have the community, which is a pity, because I did some Elixir back in the day, and it's like, I was liking it, but it didn't quite settle in the community. But it's the reason I'm bringing this up. It's because one of the things we always get, when talking to CTOs or CEOs of companies who outsource their stuff, is like, oh yeah, we work with this company and they use like this technology that then we couldn't find developers for, right? It's one of the main objections for outsourcing stuff, is they chose a tech stack that is like not aligned with the company, right? So how did you calculate then the risk between using a new technology that you knew it had the potential, but it was not yet there, and it didn't have the community, right? So how do you evaluate this? And did you really expect to hit the scale-up stage in the company, and then how would you solve hiring Elixir developers? Because at the time, it must have been like 25 in Barcelona in 2016.
So of course, that's risk-taking. So that's only, it's purely risk-taking. You're betting your stack on the future of a technology, and you expect it to adopt certain niche or even mainstream. On the case of Rails, as you mentioned, it hit mainstream, and there's a lot of mainstream companies that ended up using Rails. But when we started TeamBox back in the time, that was not so obvious. So it could have become a niche technology like Clojure in the fintech world, or Elixir. Some technologies end up having a market, but there's a niche market. Some of them end up being mainstream. It's very difficult to guess that when you're doing it. But as entrepreneurs, I think you have to take these risks, because when you start, you have absolutely nothing, so you have nothing to lose, like Bob Dylan says. And so you have to take these kind of risks, and that was a little bit the risk I was taking. Although after I set out with the most safe option, which was Rails, which worked pretty well for us in the end.
But you started coding the Elixir project, or not really? That was okay. Well, so how much time did it take to rewrite it?
I did a couple of weeks of Elixir project. I showed some part of the MVP to Jordi, and Jordi was like, "Whoa, it's very cool, but can we do it in Rails, please? I just wanted to install the device and get going, And then in 1 month, we launched the MVP. So in 1 month, Jordi and me were able to launch the MVP and put it into some friends and family companies. So they were, after 1 month, people were using the software already. So that's That's the productivity that you get with Rails.
Yeah, that's one good demonstration, because most of the times we're getting from potential clients like, hey, how much time do I need this? Like, oh, I need this for 2 weeks. It's like, dude, 1 month is a good example. If both the CTO and the CEO are proficient in Rails and coding, you can get an MVP in 1 month. Otherwise, it might take longer, right? So, and you had your idea of Factorial at the time was really clear what you wanted to get, because sometimes, if there's multiple people in the project, as in that client provider, client team provider, then this gets lost in translation, and maybe there's miscommunication about the idea of the project, right?
Yeah.
And how does then once you started building in Rails, then you faced strong competition from companies like Cantox, Novicap, and Shipstead in Barcelona.
Shipstead, yeah.
I don't know. N26 were hiring Rails people,
but but if you
developers in general.
Developers in general, and they set up the bar with salaries. When they entered, suddenly everybody was like, "Whoa, that's a big salary in Barcelona."
Yeah, yeah. like what same happened with Skyscanner a couple of years back, and King.com in like 2011, things like that, right? So how was the hiring? Like, was it hard for you? Is it hard nowadays for you to find Rails developers, or not really?
So not nowadays, but the first 3 years it was extremely challenging. So of course, when you have only angel money in the bank, you have to be very careful about how you spend it, and making bad hires can completely destroy your company. So as I said, like in the beginning, you're most concerned on surviving than not to achieve certain goals. So it's more of an infinite game than a finite one. And so that's a pretty complex scenario. But I always think at every stage of your company, you must craft some sort of message of why joining your company it's the best option for certain engineers. So you have to find your niche, and you have to hire very aggressively on that niche, mostly outbound, which means finding the engineers and go and contact them. So, for instance, for the first engineers, it was very clear. We had a very strong vision. We think this product is going to be amazing. If you have entrepreneurial vibes, you're going to love to see the inception of a startup like this one. We experience entrepreneurs. Just join us, and you will learn from us. So we attracted some developers that were not just for the tech. They also were very interested on seeing a company to start, and they accepted lower market rate in exchange for that learning. As the company grew, we oriented more on a work balance message, which I truly believe on, and I think actually in MarsBased, I think you also promote a lot of that.
Yeah, right.
So we were able to attract very senior Rails developers that were maybe a bit burned out of the startup scene, of the crunching hours and delusional CEOs and things like this. And we kind of promoted this healthy working environment that attracted these senior developers, which also some of them, I have to admit, happen to be on my network from previous jobs. So that also helps.
Yeah, that's a good point, because a lot of people, like there are several kind of developers, right? We said that there's different kinds of CTOs out there. Same happens with developers. Some developers, they want to be job hoppers, and they want to just jump on the coolest startup, and then Typeform raises money. Then I'm going to go to Typeform. Then there's like Glovo. Then there's Factorial, whatever, and then they will jump to the next adventure, right? But some of them, they just want to be stable, just because they hit a certain point in life, or just because it fits more their mentality. And it's true, like most of the developers we've hired at MarsBased, they come from our previous network at previous companies, or people who want to be more stable. They've been doing freelancing for a while, or they have tested the startup thingy, and they're like, yeah, no, but like I want to have a more stable life. Yeah. So that's a great advice for people wanting to hire Rails developers, or developers in general. It's like, look at your previous companies, somebody who you have worked with, and 2 or 3 hires we've done, they didn't know Rails in the beginning, but they were good developers, and they're like, they're going to learn it, right?
Same for us. We don't hire for the whole stack. I mean, we only hire full stacks, which we call it full stack on attitude, not on knowledge. So it means people who don't mind touching anything. So it doesn't mean that they are specialists on front-end and back-end and infrastructure and everything like that. No. Like usually people are strong in one skill, maybe 1.5, 2 if you're lucky, but it doesn't matter. The challenge for us is like people who are willing to touch other technologies and other segments. So sometimes we have people that are very strong on JavaScript and they learn Rails on the job. like usually within 1 month they are pretty much ramp up. So that's not a concern at all. And sometimes it's the opposite. We hire people on Rails and they are willing to learn more about Frontend or React and things like this. So yeah, that's fine for them. Yeah.
What's the technologies you've got in the company?
Yeah, so it's mostly a Rails monolith on the backend. Although we get quite inspired by the Shopify architecture, which basically we separate the monolith with different domains, and then each domain talk to each other through an event bus. So it kind of resembles a microservice architecture, but being able to cheat, and all the domains share the same database, which allows us to have a very relational model, which is important for us. And then on the front end, we have it's a single web app, so it's a React application, and also we have the React Native application. They both consume the API of Rails. And then on infra, we have, non-surprisingly, everything on Amazon. Nowadays, the credits that you get from venture capital are so generous that you can mostly not pay for Amazon for the first 6 years of existence, and you're like super locked in, and then eventually you pay a lot.
And then you pay a fucking lot. Yeah, that's how it works.
Jeff Bezos is going for the long run, and there's
he can afford it.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, everything on Amazon, and we have everything on Docker. We don't use Kubernetes. We're a bit different on that sense. We use the HashiCorp stack, so we use Nomad, we use Consul, and all that stuff. But yeah.
All right.
That's more or less it. Very simple stack, actually. No, there's nothing very flashy.
Yeah, but then I wanted to ask, very specifically about front-end, right? Because it's one of the major concerns in companies, especially nowadays, where a lot of people take decisions as opposed to more like the previously known and used top-down decision-making, in which the CTO or whoever in the company is like, okay, we're gonna do this in Angular, and that's it, right? Or well, back in the day, it was just pure Java and Spring and whatever, right? But nowadays, seems that a lot of technical decisions in companies come bottom up, right? Does that happen in your company? And if so, specifically for frontend, where we see a huge dispersion of frameworks and libraries, and always wanting to try the new shiny things like Tailwind right now for CSS, right? Yeah. So how do you manage this, and what's the situation in the company?
Yeah, so I'm there's a lot of questions involved on that question.
I always ask a lot of questions. Yeah. Let's break them down.
I'm gonna start with JavaScript as an ecosystem, and then I'm gonna jump into decision making of Stack.
Let's do it.
JavaScript as an ecosystem was extremely volatile before 2016, but on 2016 when we started, things started to settle down. So React was becoming kind of the most famous framework, and this kind of consolidated, although Vue is a very powerful second, but it kind of got consolidated that if you're betting on React, you get a lot of developers that have experience on that, you get a rich ecosystem. So that was a very fine bet that we did early on, and it turned out pretty well. There's also other things that have settled down, such as TypeScript, the usage of Webpack, Babel, like tooling. So I do believe the volatility has decreased a lot. So it's not as before, where you could bet all your company on Backbone, and then three years later, Backbone disappeared out of
Ember.
Because Ember. Although Ember kept the niche, so that as long as at least there is a niche, I think you're fine. But some of the technologies,
and for Rails, it was better, right? Like it was better combination, but disappeared. Sorry to break you off.
But I think volatility has decreased a lot on front end, so that's super good news. Like decision making is less risky right now. And now, in terms of decision making at Factorial, so of course, people are extremely opinionated by the decisions that we're taking early on, because the more you build on top of it, the more difficult it is to get away of. For instance, early on we bet on Flow instead of TypeScript. We were big fans of gradual typing. I really like typing, but I don't like the cost of it. So gradual typing strikes a good balance to me. And Flow was an excellent tool back in 2016. But it turns out that the whole industry went with TypeScript instead. So nowadays, not many people use Flow. Most of people use TypeScript. That was difficult to guess in 2016, but it's a change that, for instance, a lot of people at Factorial want to make it happen, but it's difficult for them to make it happen because of the amount of flow that we have in the company. So there's a lot of initiatives that come from developers, but sometimes it's not easy to find the time or to find the excuses to take on those big technical challenges. That being said, we do have a space for people to propose, and these are like the RFCs. Like every developer, once in a while, they open a request for comment and then basically involve the whole tech organization into taking these sort of decisions, and that's working pretty well.
But there's an underlying truth in what you're saying. Might be hard to swallow for people because non-technical CEOs, they think that they can make all the mistakes in the world because, oh, my product's going to change. I'm going to iterate. I'm going to like ask questions. Going to go lean startup. But the CTO needs to nail it with the tech stack from the very beginning, right? And that's something that we see. Like, it's not right. It's absolutely not right. Like, I think that what's normal is what you're saying. You wanted to do Elixir, it didn't work, and it was this instead of TypeScript. And that's what happens in every company. But non-technical CEOs will not understand this. And that's precisely, in turn, why most of the times they will not be able to find a CTO, right? Because I was like, well, if you can't understand the complexities of software, that doesn't mean you have to learn how to code, but you need to understand the cost of changing, that we're going to fuck up, that we're going to take some decisions that if you change the product too much, my assumptions will not work anymore, right? So every time, it's easy to work with Jordi because he's a developer, right?
Yeah.
But how would have you explained that to a non-technical CEO, right? It's like, oh, you changed the product so much, now I cannot use this technology. It's not the right fit, right? How would you go about it?
Yeah, that's a difficult one. I mean, I've worked with CEOs that were not technical, but they need to be intelligent. So, like, I think an intelligent enough person is able to understand that as you progress on a company, it's kind of like in your life, no? So when I was 20-year-old, everything fit on a backpack. I could go to San Francisco, I could go traveling. And with just one backpack, I could go around. I had a lot of freedom. I could make decisions very easily. But nowadays, if I want to move a country, I need to sell a house. I need to find a new kindergarten. I need to do so many things. The cost of change now is so much greater because I have more dependencies. So I think that works equally on a business. As you grow on a business, you get customers, you get features, you get all these things that are cool because then, those are assets that you have as a company. But each one of these things also slow you down in making decisions because then, it's like having a car. If you have a car, you have to sell it if you want to move abroad or something like this. So I would compare it. I would use that metaphor probably, that the more dependencies you have, the more difficult it's to make change. But you need these dependencies in order to grow a business. Although there's ways to minimize it, I guess, as well. So that's also the job of the CTO, trying to encapsulate these dependencies as much as possible. So, yeah.
That's a good analogy. But actually, you're more than 4 years in, if I recall correctly, now at Factorial. So do you envision that you will need to change significantly your tech stack in the near future or not really? And what's the predictions?
So there's a big investment, and that's again comes down to that technology vision that you have to have very clear. So biggest challenge for Factorial is that HR is not a global. It's not a global problem. It's a local problem. So when you want to serve French customers, Spanish, Mexican, American, English, and so on, it's not like a task management tool where you just make it once and it works everywhere. You have to make it ad hoc for each country because they have different compliance and law and so on. And that's extremely difficult because, as we mentioned before, you get dependencies and then changes are difficult to make. So maybe if you want to make French customers happy, how do you do that without making Spanish customers unhappy? So there's a lot of these technological discussions going on. So there's a technological vision that we had very clear from the beginning, together with Cesar, who is the person leading product. And we work together very close to nail that product and technical vision, which is mostly to have a layer of abstractions that allow us to build on top. So that's one of the biggest investments we are doing. And that means that a lot of things that we built during the first 3 years, we have to completely put them down and rebuild them differently. So we're doing that at the moment. We did a lot of effort last year. We're doing it also this year. We have to finish some other things, but that's the biggest investment we're doing, and it's constantly renewing all the code that we produced in the past. So we constantly rewriting. We're changing the motor while the car is driving, and that's part of your job, because you have to keep adding customers, you have to keep growing the business, you have to keep hiring people, but at the same time, the technical pieces that you built in the past don't work for the future, and you have to replace them from scratch. Yeah.
But these local or localized nuances, are they mostly like back end or front end? Because it's a back end and you got a monolith that might be hard to change. On the other hand, it's Rails, so it's easy to sort of. Okay.
So like just an example, like as an employee in Spain, you may want to have a field for IRPF because that's something that works in Spain. You know, we have this tax system here, and in all countries they don't have it. So you need somehow a way to store this data on the database for Spanish customers, but you don't need it on French customers. But you also need a way to display it, and maybe even managers want a report of the IRPF for their employees, while that's not something that the French customers want. So you need these sort of abstractions both in the front end and in the back end to allow the product to be flexible enough to adapt to these different local markets.
Then is it? Are you guys building it on a multi-tenant architecture? How do you go about this?
Yeah, that's the case. It's a multi-tenant application. We don't do on-premise. That's as easy as that. Like most SaaS nowadays.
Okay, and how about like the dispersion of other, like, because every company ends up producing byproducts or side projects or test ideas or pilots or marketing sites, right? How do you choose the technology there? Who takes the decision, and what are the technologies that you've invested in?
Yeah, that's also a lot of questions.
A lot of questions.
Yeah, I'm going to stick with marketing, because I think that's one of the most interesting, and it's one where I would be most interested to learn about other companies, how they are doing. So marketing, for instance, it's one of these things that are critical to a business, because if no one visits your website, no one signs up, no one knows about your brand, then you don't get customers, then your product is completely useless. And yet it's something that most of the time you don't optimize for when you're hiring or when you're doing the stack for. So in our case, for instance, we were looking for developers that were very good at Rails, that were very good at React, or both, and these kind of things. But then, of course, marketing team, what's the first thing they ask? They ask for a WordPress, and we don't have anyone who knows how WordPress works, And then there's the extension always about, like, do we optimize for developers or do we optimize for marketing? Because marketing have their plugins, their way of working, their experience, and so on. You don't want to put them a tool they don't love doing. But at the same time, then our developers, they don't want to be touching PHP because maybe that's a language they don't like, So
especially coming from Rails.
Yeah. So that's a tension that I think happens in many companies. I actually don't have that many answers. I have more questions than answers on that topic. I would be very interested to know how other companies deal with that specific technological problem, which is the marketing stack.
Yeah, and how about like the other side process, like tech hygiene, right? So how often do you revise all the projects going on? How do you keep them alive or not? When do you do this kind of spring cleaning?
Yeah, so that's a different topic. So we have a team actually that is dedicated to. So it's a team that is not client facing. So they don't build tech for customers. They build tech for other teams, and they basically have a roadmap of all the technologies that we have, like whether it's like versions of a different modules or libraries, or be abstractions that we build. Like we have certain abstractions and some certain internal libraries that we created ourselves. This team is responsible for keeping this up to date and improve those. So it's a dedicated team. In the past, it used to be that they had one day available a week to do this sort of work. Before I also tried to do like 1 week a month, something like this. I tried many things, but in the end, I believe it's better to have a team with a roadmap and with objectives, and that they commit, okay, this quarter we're going to do this because this is going to enable teams doing this and that. And we also want to deprecate this because this is slowing down teams. And they track certain metrics like how much time does it take from a pull request to be opened to being on production, because we want to be shipping like very fast and in quick iterations. So there's a team concentrated and looking only at this set of problems, and I think that works pretty well so far.
That's something you don't hear much unless you're talking to like really, really big companies. So probably the reason why is because if you got a team like that, you might be tempted to use them for your product when you need to speed up things, right? And you need to like go for a crunch or something. But how do you avoid this to happen? Like, how do you?
Well, it does happen, but
it does happen.
Yeah, it does happen, but it happens on a sane way. So after all,
it's calculated risk.
Their customers are other teams. So a good example is last year we built a new version of our payroll product, and this new payroll version was built on top of our abstractions layer I talked before. So it was completely using new technology. So of course, when we exposed it to beta customers, there were like issues, there were like bugs and things and so on. So a lot of these issues were fixed by the platform team. So they kind of were fixing things for end customers, but actually what they were doing, they were improving these underlying abstractions and technologies that were responsible for the bugs. So they were acting as a proxy, but they were actually improving the tech stack. So that's what they were doing, but through a customer-facing feature that was using those libraries and those abstractions. So yeah, it does happen, but always keeping in mind that's the boundary and that's what you touch.
Let's talk a little bit to kind of like wrap up. I wanted to talk a little bit with connection to keeping the lights on projects, right? That's something we discussed in the past with one of the VPs at Amazon in one of our first episodes. It was super interesting to talk about tech hygiene, keeping lights on and keeping lights off, right? So he was actually actively working to kill projects because they had too many. Obviously, at Amazon, they must have like a fuck ton of projects, right? How do you distribute time and resources in projects to keep them on, right? Like side projects or smaller tests.
That's one of the most overlooked questions, and I think it's one of the most important questions you have to have an answer at every stage, because this will change radically as a company grows.
Correct.
So for me, the answer, and this is something I repeat very often, but it's key to me, it's to work very close with your product lead. So that's extremely important, that there's full alignment product and technology. Like you can have the best engineers, you can have the best tech stack. If you don't work closely with your product person, there's no way that you can have like a shipping organization, like an organization that is effective. And with that, I mean setting up processes for how do you come up with initiatives or projects or hypotheses, whatever you want to call it. How do you execute on them? How do you kill them? How do you keep the lights on, as you said? And setting these processes. And in our case, right now, and these have been changing every single year because we've been adapting as the company has grown. And we mostly, what we have is we have autonomous teams, and each one of the teams have an objective, which means as a management team, we give them a direction and we say, like, as a team, you have to go there. And then you figure out how to do that. Then the team proposes initiatives or hypotheses that they want to validate through the quarter, and those are the bets that they're going to make. So they say, okay, I have a quarter to reach the objective, so I'm going to make these 4 bets that are very big, these 10 bets that are medium, and these 20 bets that are very small. Every team works differently. Some teams only do incrementalisms. Some teams do like bigger bets, but more risky because they don't know the outcomes. It's up to them. But they do commit to them, which means they set up the amount of time they want to dedicate on that bet. Because a bet, after all, it's money that you put on the table and an expectation of a return. So maybe they say, we want to dedicate 4 weeks of this quarter into trying this thing out. If it doesn't work, we kill it. So that's very important for us. What tends to happen is that we negotiate scope. So we may want to ship something very big in 4 weeks, and we end up shipping something that is radically smaller if we find problems along the way. In terms of keeping the lights on, so that's in terms of new initiatives, like more strategic decisions and more like reaching the objectives. In terms of keeping the lights on, each one of these teams every week dedicates one person to what we call firefighting. It's a role that most companies have, which basically is a person looking at the backlog. And that's a rotational role. So every week, the teams dedicate someone different. And that's also, I think it's great for developers also to get to know other parts of the code base, because we have a unique backlog. We don't have a backlog for each team. Also because teams kind of are a living thing. So we keep only one backlog, and then everybody goes and fetches the most important tasks from that backlog, which is created by customer experience, which basically are the ones facing customers and the ones who feel the pain when the product does not work.
All right. I could be talking to you for hours about tech debt and documentation and testing and other things that we haven't really touched on today. And so I think we'll have to record like a second part, but I want to be very, very thankful for your time. One last question before we wrap it up. And I think this always provides like good answers from people, as we like to wrap it up by asking our guests here, what is the biggest technical fuck up they've ever done? And if you can quantify it in money.
Yeah. Well, that's a funny one. Yeah, actually, mine is pretty funny. So
it's pretty expensive as well.
It was not expensive. There was backup in place, but that was.
Let's go for it.
When I was a like super junior developer, I was working on Flash back then. Rest in peace. Just been killed.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was mostly doing on a marketing agency doing like Flash games for Rico del Polo and things like that. So very, very special job. So I was working on a project, and it was like a kind of a learning platform where people uploaded kind of like Moodle kind of a platform where people learning materials and so on. And I wanted to test changing a name of a user. So I went to the console and I said, update user set name Paco. And then I press enter without setting where ID equals 1. So I rename all the users' names to Paco. So suddenly on the learning platform, everybody was called Paco. And then I had to go to my boss and ask, like, hey, do you have a backup by any chance? Because now
how many people were affected by this?
Tens of thousands, yeah. A lot of Pacos.
I mean, that's a pretty common name. So
yeah. I don't know. It was it was pretty funny.
It was a good one. I think we can wrap it up here. As I said, like there are tons of things that I had on my list to talk with you, but it's been super interesting. So thank you for your time. Pau, you've got 1 minute. Let's use this. What's going on in your life? What's going on in Factorial? How can we help you?
Well, I mean, the most obvious thing is we are hiring, and we especially are trying to hire more women. Like we want to increase diversity, and that's becoming challenging. I'm trying to find as many as I can, but as you all know, that's a difficult topic. So if any is listening, just talk to me. We would like to have you on our team.
Thank you very much. Thank you also to our listeners, and see you in the next episode. Bye-bye.
Okay, thanks. Bye.